All right, using your worksheet, we want to draw some guidelines from the vertical line on the right of the page. We're going to call this telephone pole 1. So we're going to draw a guideline from the top of telephone pole 1 to the vanishing point. Then we want to draw a second guideline from the bottom of telephone pole number 1 to the vanishing point. Now you get to choose where you put the second telephone pole. It just needs to be in between the guidelines you just drew. So if you draw it too close to the first one, you're going to have a lot of telephone poles to draw. So I recommend going about halfway between where the first telephone pole is and the vanishing point. And all we need right now is just a vertical line. We are not going to worry about drawing any details. We just want to get the placement of these right. Now inside the space between the first and the second telephone pole, we need to construct an X. We want to be very precise when we do this. Make sure that the lines that you draw connect to the tops and the bottoms of their respective poles. Now that intersecting point that we get for the X is very valuable. We want that information because we're going to draw a guideline from that point back to the vanishing point. What that line gives us is basically half the height of our telephone poles all the way back to the distance. That's really going to help us as we try to construct the next telephone poles down in the row. So once you know how to do this, it's super simple, but we're going to go from the top of the first telephone pole through the middle of the second telephone pole, and where our ruler touches that bottom guideline, that's the point where our third telephone pole should be. So we'll just put a dot right there. And then all we have to do is draw a vertical line. Make sure that it's parallel with the other telephone pole. And now we're starting to get that foreshortening. So the space between telephone poles starts to look compressed. And we just repeat that process. To get the fourth telephone pole, we're going to draw a guideline from the top of telephone pole 2 through the middle of telephone pole 3. And where the ruler hits the bottom guideline, that point is where our fourth telephone pole should be. And this is just a rinse and repeat process. Once you understand this, you can keep doing it. So from the top of the third telephone pole through the middle of the fourth, where the ruler hits the bottom guideline, that's where our fifth telephone pole should be. And you just rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Now, after you do about 6, 7, maybe 8 telephone poles, everything gets so compressed and tiny, you're probably going to run out of room to even get this with your ruler. And that's okay, because it's so far out in the distance, you can just start to sketch in little lines. It could practically be scribbles. In fact, sometimes I'll just use my ruler and just go back and forth against the edge of my ruler with my pencil and just slide the ruler towards the vanishing point. I mean, at this point, nobody's going to notice. Nobody's really going to care. You just need some visual static out there in the distance to just symbolize just a series of telephone poles. Okay. Now, once you have that, don't worry about any of the details yet. This technique can be applied also on the left-hand side. So you see a little vertical line over there. That's just representing a fence post. So we've done some telephone poles, and now we can do the same thing with fence posts. There's really not a lot different here, except I think telephone poles give you a little bit more room to see your construction lines and what's exactly going on. Now that you're in a smaller space, I think it helps to be a little bit more precise. So just pay very careful attention to what you're doing. But again, you can choose where you want the second fence post to be. Construct an X between the first and the second fence post. The intersection of that X matters. We want that point because it gives us a way to cut all of our fence posts in half in the distance. So we just connect that intersecting point with a guideline to the vanishing point. Okay? And now I'm doing it kind of the opposite way. I'm going from the bottom of the first fence post through the middle of the second fence post, just to show you that you can construct it either way. It doesn't really matter. The most important thing is getting it accurate. So you want your ruler lined up before you draw your lines. And then you want to make sure that your lines are vertical. If you get them diagonal at all, it's going to make your fence post look wonky and tilted and weird. So you want the foreshortening happening. You want to make sure that ruler is as vertical as you can possibly get it. And again, after you do about 6, 7, maybe 8 fence posts, you're starting to get so compressed with information that you can just sketch the rest of the fence posts in. And that visual static is enough to carry the idea all the way out to forever. Okay, well, after you've done the telephone poles and done the fence posts, you can do the same thing with a pathway. Okay, if you look down at the bottom of the activity sheet, there's a dot on the right-hand side and a dot on the left-hand side. That's just to give you the edges of a road or a pathway, and that could be a paved road, it could be a dirt road, a gravel road, it could be a boardwalk. Some students like to try and do railroad tracks, but there are multiple elements in the railroad tracks, from the rails to the railroad ties and the gravel. That's a little bit more complex than I recommend doing if you're new to one-point perspective. And some people would say, well, why would you even break up the space on the pathway? And the reason why I do it is it gives you tiers of detail, meaning the things that are closest to you. If you just have a section marked off, that just helps you know, okay, this is a pretty high detail section. And then as you take a step into the distance, you know, okay, I can get away with just some light texture in here. And then beyond that, I can put in just visual static. And as long as I've got those 3 to 4 tiers of detailed layers, so to speak, it's really going to make your drawing convincing. Okay, so it's a little bit different strategy than something as precise as repeating items in the distance, right? If you've got telephone poles, you want to know exactly where each pole should go. With this, we're really trying to get 4 distinct sections. And so you'll notice this first, what looks like a trapezoid here, that's going to be the area that has the most detail in it. So if this were a gravel road, in the very forefront, you would see every little piece of gravel, right? So that first section, we just pay a lot more attention to those little micro pieces of information. But it's the same construction. It's the same geometry. You're going to put an X within that first trapezoid, so to speak. You're going to draw a guideline back from the center of the X to the vanishing point, and then you're just going to choose either the right side or the left side. You're going to go from that first line to the second line, actually first line to the middle of the second line, and that's going to give you the spot for your third line. So the terminology changes because they're no longer fence posts or telephone poles, but it's the exact same construction method. So if you've understood the initial part, this will probably be pretty easy for you. If it's a little bit confusing, you can always rotate your page and think of it just like doing telephone poles again until you really get the hang of it. And when I'm teaching my students in class, they will do several iterations of this activity. We've probably done this 5 or 6 times together because the repetition of it is what allows you to visit the content that you don't understand yet. So most of them start really strong after we've done it 3 times. They know to put their guidelines in. They know to put the X in. And then they start to wrestle with the fact of, oh, I need a guideline from the center of my X back to my vanishing point. And then on about the 4th or 5th try, they're really starting to grapple with the idea of how to construct this by drawing guidelines from the top of one through the middle of the next to get the third one. So this is the kind of activity I recommend printing several copies of it. And then when you get successful with that, you can start to build out the bigger forms. So the telephone poles obviously are cylinders. Your fence posts could also be cylinders, or they might be cubes, depending on what style of fence you want to draw. The railings are really good, and I'll have another video for that. But for now, this is enough. Okay, it's enough to understand this much. If you want to do something more complex and organic, like say you wanted to do some clouds in the sky, you can use this same method, but we're going to basically start with a rectangle. And this is going to be a rectangle, 2-dimensional to start with, but we're going to draw guidelines back from the corners of these rectangles to the vanishing point and turn that rectangle into a cube. That's going to give us a couple of things. It's going to give us some volume for our cloud, which is good, meaning it's not going to just look like a flat cloud, but it's also going to give us the bottom plane. And the bottom plane is where shadow will be on the cloud if it's high noon, so to speak. If the sun is above the clouds, you're going to see the upper portion of the cloud will be light and the lower portion will have shadow in it. And most people don't think about it this way, but clouds tend to be relatively flat on their bottom because they're sitting on some kind of pressure in the atmosphere that would allow them, that causes them to sit where they rest. So we don't think about it that way because clouds are translucent and they've got all kinds of interesting shapes going on, but there's a bit of flatness to the bottom, and so you can kind of think of it as sitting on that bottom plane, at least until you grasp the idea of how to structure these as they go back towards the vanishing point. So we just used the guidelines from the first cube we did, and we're just putting another cloud that would fit within a similar size cube way out in the distance. And that may not seem realistic, right? Because clouds are always different shapes. But what it does for you visually when you see the height difference and the size difference, the higher the clouds are, the bigger they are. And then as they come down to the horizon line, they just get smaller and smaller. It gives you this feeling like, wow, they're way off in the distance. And it's just a great way to kind of finish off this lesson and start to bring it into a less mathematical feeling art form. And you can put more than one square or rectangle in the sky. You can try this over and over. You just want to make sure that the first one is the closest one to you. So push it up a little bit on the page. Don't make it super close to the horizon line, and give it some good volume so you've got a nice big cloud to start with. And then just watch how the depth of this piece comes together. It's really quite satisfying, in my opinion, and gives your picture a much more pleasant feel, because everything else just looks like geometry and measurements, and it's a little bit stale, I guess. And this just allows you to finish with a little bit of artistic flair. So I hope you've enjoyed this activity. I hope it helped you. If it did, please give it a thumbs up. Comment if you have any questions. I'll try to answer them the best that I can. And if you need this activity, it is there at MrHen.com. So thank you so much for watching. And as always, have a great day.